Please explain in detail about AP U.S. government and politics on required Supreme cases. 9. Schenck vs. United States, 1919 Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. 10. New York Times vs. U.S., 1971 Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. 11. McDonald vs. Chicago, 2010 Selective Incorporation. And 12. Gideon vs. Wainwright, 1963 Selective Incorporation. 9. Schenck vs. United States, 1919 Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. Schenck vs. United States, a landmark 1919 Supreme Court case, dealt with the issue of free speech during times of war. Charles Schenck, General Secretary of the Socialist Party, had been distributing leaflets encouraging men to resist the draft during World War I. Schenck was charged with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it a crime to obstruct military recruitment or encourage insubordination. The central question before the Supreme Court was whether the government could limit an individual's free speech rights during wartime. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that Schenck's actions were not protected by the First Amendment. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., writing for the court, introduced the clear and present danger test, arguing that speech can be restricted if it creates a clear and present danger of bringing about the substantive evils that Congress has the right to prevent. Schenck's actions were seen as posing a threat to national security, and thus his conviction was upheld. This case established that the First Amendment is not absolute and can be limited under certain circumstances. 10. New York Times vs. U.S., 1971 Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. In the New York Times vs. United States, also known as the Pentagon Papers case, the Supreme Court dealt with the issue of prior restraint and freedom of the press. In 1971, the New York Times and the Washington Post began publishing excerpts from a classified Department of Defense study about the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration sought to prevent further publication, arguing that it posed a threat to national security. The case reached the Supreme Court, which had to decide whether the government's attempts to halt publication were a violation of the First Amendment. In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled in favor of the newspapers, holding that the government had not met the heavy burden of showing justification for imposing prior restraint. The court emphasized the importance of a free press in a democratic society and asserted that any attempt to restrict it must meet an exceptionally high standard. This case reaffirmed the First Amendment's protection of the press and limited the government's ability to impose prior restraints on publication. 11. McDonald vs. Chicago, 2010 Selective Incorporation. McDonald vs. Chicago was a pivotal 2010 Supreme Court case dealing with the Second Amendment and the doctrine of selective incorporation. In this case, Otis McDonald, a Chicago resident, challenged the city's strict gun control laws, arguing that they violated his Second Amendment right to bear arms. The central issue was whether the Second Amendment applied to state and local governments through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled in favor of McDonald, holding that the Second Amendment was incorporated and thus applicable to state and local governments. The majority opinion, written by Justice Samuel Alito, argued that the right to bear arms was fundamental to the American scheme of ordered liberty and deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. The McDonald decision expanded the reach of the Second Amendment, limiting the ability of state and local governments to impose strict gun control measures. 12. Gideon vs. Wainwright, 1963 Selective Incorporation. Gideon vs. Wainwright was a landmark 1963 Supreme Court case that significantly impacted the American criminal justice system. Clarence Earl Gideon, charged with breaking and entering, was denied the right to an attorney by a Florida court because he could not afford one. Gideon argued that this denial violated his Sixth Amendment right to counsel. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Gideon's favor, holding that the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of counsel applied to state courts through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. The court reasoned that a fair trial was impossible without the presence of legal counsel, regardless of the defendant's ability to pay. Writing for the court, Justice Hugo Black emphasized the importance of the right to counsel as a fundamental aspect of a fair and just legal system. The Gideon decision had a profound impact on the American criminal justice system, as it established the principle that state courts must provide legal counsel to indigent defendants facing serious criminal charges. This ruling significantly expanded the rights of accused individuals and underscored the importance of equal access to justice, regardless of financial means. In summary, These 4 Supreme Court cases represent critical moments in American legal history that have shaped the interpretation and application of civil liberties and civil rights. Schenck v. United States established the clear and present danger test, which allows the government to limit free speech under certain circumstances. NYTimes v. U.S. reaffirmed the importance of a free press and set a high standard for government attempts to impose prior restraint. McDonald v. Chicago expanded the reach of the Second Amendment, making it applicable to state and local governments through the doctrine of selective incorporation. Finally, Gideon v. Wainwright established the right to legal counsel for indigent defendants facing serious criminal charges, ensuring equal access to justice in the American criminal justice system. Each of these cases has significantly influenced the development and understanding of civil liberties and civil rights in the United States.